The war was over. The Nazis were defeated. The camps were liberated. The world called it victory. But for 250,000 people, nobody told them the war was over. Because for them, the nightmare had just begun. And the ones who started it were not the Soviets. They were the Americans and the British. And they did it in secret. They gave it a code name. They called it Operation Keelhaul. And for 40 years, almost nobody knew it existed. It is 1945. The guns have gone quiet across Europe. Millions of displaced people are flooding into Allied-controlled camps in Austria and Germany. Cossacks who fought against Stalin. Soviet civilians who fled the Red Army. White Russian soldiers who had been running from communism since 1917. Women, children, priests, families who had nothing left except the fact that they were still alive. They walked into those Allied camps believing one thing, that the Americans and the British would protect them. That is not what happened. In February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill sat across a table from Joseph Stalin at Yalta. They shook hands. They made agreements. One of those agreements was never meant to be spoken of publicly. It said this: every Soviet national found in Allied-controlled territory must be returned to the Soviet Union. Every single one. No exceptions. No appeals. No choice. Stalin wanted them back, and Roosevelt and Churchill handed them over. Now here is what you need to understand about who these people were. Many of them were not soldiers. Many of them had done nothing wrong. Many of them had simply been on the wrong side of a border when the war swept through. And every single one of them knew what going back to the Soviet Union meant. It meant the Gulag. It meant interrogation. It meant execution. They had watched what Stalin did to people he considered traitors. They had seen entire villages erased. They were terrified. And the Allied commanders knew they were terrified. And they did it anyway. The first transports began quietly. Allied soldiers arrived at the camps and told the residents to gather their belongings. Some went calmly, still not believing what was happening. Others refused. They got down on their knees and begged. Grown men, former soldiers, pressed their faces into the dirt and wept. Women held their children and would not let go. A group of Cossack officers stripped off their uniforms, knelt together in the open field, and prayed out loud. Some slit their wrists rather than board the trucks. Some hanged themselves inside the barracks the night before. And American soldiers physically loaded them anyway. British soldiers physically loaded them anyway. Under orders. Under the Yalta Agreement. Under the seal of two democratic governments that had just spent 6 years telling the world they were fighting for freedom. One British officer later wrote that what he witnessed that day never left him. He described men who had fought with valor throwing themselves under truck wheels. He described a priest holding a cross above his head, still praying, as Soviet soldiers closed in. He described children screaming. He said he followed his orders. He said he never forgave himself. The Cossack leadership was handled separately, and even more brutally. Their senior officers were invited to a meeting. They were told it was a conference to discuss their situation. They dressed in their formal uniforms. They arrived. They were arrested on the spot and handed directly to Soviet secret police. Many were executed within weeks of returning to Soviet soil. The ones who survived went into the labor camps of Siberia. Some stayed there for the next 15 years. And here is the detail that almost no history textbook includes. Many of the people forcibly returned under Operation Keelhaul were not even Soviet citizens. Some had emigrated from Russia after the revolution in 1917, decades before the Second World War even began. They had never lived under Soviet rule. Some held foreign passports. Some had been born in other countries entirely. None of that mattered. If a Soviet liaison officer pointed at you and said Soviet national, you went on the truck. The British operation in Austria was particularly brutal. In the town of Linz, in May 1945, thousands of Cossack families, men, women, children, elderly, had gathered, trusting that the British forces would not remove them by force. They were wrong. British soldiers moved through the camp with rifle butts and batons. People were dragged from tents. Mothers were separated from children in the chaos. Several people threw themselves into the river drow rather than be taken. The river carried their bodies downstream while British soldiers loaded the trucks. That day in Linz became known to the Cossack people as the Great Betrayal. And almost no one in Britain has ever been taught it happened. For decades, the Allied governments kept this classified. The full documentation was locked in archives. Veterans who participated were told not to speak about it. Historians who got close to the story were met with sealed files and official silence. It was not until the 1970s that a scholar named Julius Epstein began pulling the truth into the open. It was not until 1990 that the British government quietly acknowledged what had happened. No formal apology, no reparations. A quiet acknowledgement buried in a parliamentary document almost no one read. 250,000 people were forcibly repatriated under Operation Keelhaul. That is the confirmed minimum. Some historians believe the number was significantly higher. Of those returned, an unknown number were executed immediately upon arrival on Soviet soil. The rest entered a system designed to break them. The last survivors of the Siberian camps from this operation were not released until after Stalin's death in 1953. Some not until the early 1960s. And when they were released, they were not allowed to speak about what had happened to them. They came home to a world that had already forgotten they ever existed. Now I need you to stop for a moment, because this is the part that should make you angry. This story was deliberately buried, not by accident, not by the passage of time, but by the active decisions of governments that were embarrassed by what they had done. Democratic governments. Governments that built monuments to the liberation of Europe. Governments that prosecuted war crimes at Nuremberg, while simultaneously handing terrified civilians to a regime that would kill them. The cognitive dissonance of that should not sit easily with you. It does not sit easily with me. And here is the question that historians are still arguing about today. Did Roosevelt and Churchill know exactly what they were sending these people back to? The evidence strongly suggests they did. Intelligence reports from inside the Soviet Union were circulating at the highest levels of Allied command. The nature of Stalin's purges was not a secret to anyone in those rooms. They made a strategic calculation. They decided that the return of Soviet POWs held in German camps was worth more than the lives of 250,000 displaced civilians. They traded human lives for geopolitical convenience. And then they classified the paperwork. What you have just heard is only part of this story. There are details we have not covered yet that will make what you already know seem like the introduction. The specific fates of individual Cossack commanders. The British officers who tried to resist the orders and were overruled. The survivors who spent the next 40 years trying to get the world to listen. The political battle to get this story into the history books. We will cover all of it. But right now, this video needs to reach more people. Every person who watches this and keeps scrolling without sharing is letting this story stay buried. These people were silenced once by governments with power. Do not let them be silenced again by an algorithm. Share this video right now. Not later. Right now. And drop a comment below. One word is enough. Write Keelhaul so we know you made it to the end. Because the people who stayed watching this to the final second are exactly the kind of people this channel exists for. And if there is a piece of suppressed history you have never seen covered, a story that should be known and is not, drop it in the comments. This channel exists to drag the buried stories into the light. The ones they classified. The ones they hoped you would never find. We are just getting started.